Tonight, a story about a small boat and a very large ocean, and about a man working out where he was with a sextant and a pencil. I want to say the ending first, so that you can relax into it. Everybody came home. All 28 men of the expedition survived, and not one of them was lost. So there is nothing here to be anxious about. This is a story about seamanship and patience, not about peril. You do not need to follow it closely, or remember the names. If you fall asleep in the middle of it, the boat will carry on sailing east without you, which is precisely what it did. The situation, told plainly. In 1914, an expedition led by Ernest Shackleton sailed south with the intention of crossing the Antarctic continent on foot. They never landed. Their ship, the Endurance, became held in the sea ice of the Weddell Sea, drifted with it for months, and was eventually crushed and lost. The men took to the ice with 3 lifeboats hauled off the ship, camped on floes as the ice carried them slowly north, and when the floes broke up they launched the boats and made for the nearest land. That land was Elephant Island, a steep, bare, uninhabited rock at the northern edge of the Antarctic Peninsula, well outside any shipping route. 28 men were now ashore on a beach a few hundred meters long. They had tents, some stores, and 2 upturned boats they turned into a shelter. Nobody in the world knew where they were. There was no radio. There would be no search, because there was nowhere to search. So the problem became a very simple one, of the kind that has only one answer. Somebody was going to have to go and get help. The nearest inhabited place was South Georgia, an island of whaling stations about 800 nautical miles away to the northeast. Closer land existed to the west, but the winds and currents in the Southern Ocean run steadily eastward, and sailing against them in a small boat would have been close to impossible. So the sensible choice was the difficult-sounding one: go with the weather, across open ocean, to a small island a long way off. 6 men would go. Shackleton himself, Frank Worsley, the captain of the lost ship and the expedition's navigator, Tom Crean, Harry McNish, the carpenter, and 2 experienced seamen, Timothy McCarthy and John Vincent. 22 would stay behind on the beach under the command of Frank Wild, and wait. The waiting, in some ways, was the harder job, and it went on for over 4 months. But it was done in an organized way, with routines and duties and a daily ration, which is how people get through long stretches of not very much happening. Wild kept the men occupied, kept the shelter in repair, and by several accounts rolled up his sleeping bag each morning and told them the boat might come today, so they had better be ready for it. Whether or not he used those exact words, the effect was the same. Nobody on that beach was permitted to stop expecting. The boat they took was called the James Caird, after one of the expedition's backers. She was a ship's whaler, 22.5 feet long, which is not much longer than a modest garden. Open to the sky. Designed for short trips between a ship and a shore, not for crossing an ocean. So the carpenter set about changing her. McNish had almost no materials, and what he did was ingenious. He raised her sides using timber taken from the packing cases and from another boat. He built a light frame over the top and covered it with canvas, so there was a partial deck to keep the water out, sewing the canvas by hand after thawing it over a blubber stove because it was frozen too stiff to work. He sealed the seams with whatever was available, including artists' oil paints and seal blood, and caulked with lampwick. He fitted a mast for a small sail. Then a ton of shingle from the beach was carried aboard in bags as ballast, to keep her upright and steady. She was never going to be comfortable. But she was going to float, and she was going to stay the right way up. They sailed on the 24th of April, 1916. The stores were carefully worked out: sledging rations, biscuit, sugar, dried milk, some nut food, 2 small stoves, paraffin, and casks of water. There were 2 compasses, a pair of binoculars, some charts, and, most importantly, a sextant and a chronometer. A chronometer is simply a very accurate clock, and it is the heart of navigation. If you know the exact time, and you can measure the height of the sun above the horizon, you can work out where you are. The expedition had started with 24 chronometers. After nearly 2 years of being frozen, dragged and soaked, only one was still considered trustworthy, and that one went into the boat, wrapped carefully and kept as still and as warm as anything could be kept. Everything depended on it. If the chronometer was wrong, the longitude would be wrong, and if the longitude was wrong, the island would simply not be where they expected it, and they would sail past into 2,000 miles of empty water. So the chronometer was treated rather like a sleeping animal. It was not to be knocked, not to be chilled, not to be allowed to stop. Worsley wound it, checked it, and kept it about his person, and the small steady ticking of it went with them the whole way across, under the canvas, in the dark, keeping London time while the boat travelled further and further from anywhere at all. Life aboard settled into something that was uncomfortable but at least regular. 3 men on watch, 3 men below, 4 hours at a time. Below meant crawling forward under the canvas deck into a space too low to sit up in, over the shingle ballast and the stores, into reindeerskin sleeping bags that were permanently wet. Getting in or out took a good 10 minutes of careful wriggling in the dark, and the man ahead of you had to move first. On watch, one steered, one worked the sail, one bailed or pumped. Twice a day they lit the little stove, which had to be held by one man while a second fed it and a third steadied the pot, and made a hot meal of dried rations, which they ate straight from the pot with the boat moving under them. There was tobacco. There was very little conversation of consequence, by all accounts. The days were grey and the nights were long, because it was late autumn in the far south. They were, essentially, camping in a wet cupboard while the cupboard was being moved about, and doing so for over 2 weeks. Worsley's navigation is the part of this story I find genuinely remarkable, and it is worth going slowly over how it works. To fix your position at sea, you measure the angle between the sun and the horizon at the moment the sun is at its highest, note the exact time, and then do a set of calculations with printed tables. The angle gives you your latitude, how far north or south. The time gives you your longitude, how far east or west. It is elegant, and it depends entirely on being able to see both the sun and the horizon clearly at the right moment. In the Southern Ocean in autumn, the sky is very often solid cloud. Over the whole crossing of 16 days, Worsley was able to take only 4 usable sights of the sun. 4. On the other 12 days the sky gave him nothing. There was no glimpse of a star at night either, in most cases, and even when there was, a horizon in darkness is very hard to judge. On every other day he had nothing but dead reckoning, an estimate of speed, an estimate of heading, an estimate of drift, worked forward hour by hour from the last known position, and written down in a book that was constantly getting wet. The physical business of taking a sight in those conditions is almost comic. A sextant requires a steady hand and a clear line to the horizon, and the boat was doing neither steady nor clear. So 2 men would hold Worsley around the waist and shoulders while he knelt or half stood, waiting for the boat to come up on the top of a swell so that he could see the horizon at all. He would catch the sun in the mirror for perhaps a second or 2, in a gap in the cloud, and call the moment, and someone would read the chronometer. Then he crawled back under the canvas to do the arithmetic, on damp paper, with the light of a small flame, in a space where he could not sit upright, while everything moved. His logbook is preserved, and the figures in it are smudged and cramped and, in places, corrected. Out of that, 4 times in 16 days, he produced a position. Everything in between was informed guesswork of a very high order, built on a lifetime of watching how a boat behaves in a given wind. The weather was mostly what you would expect from that stretch of ocean: a long westerly swell, frequent gales, spray coming over constantly, and cold that soaked in and stayed. There was one particular difficulty worth mentioning, calmly, because it shows the sort of ordinary problem that mattered most. Spray freezing on the canvas deck and the rigging built up into a thick layer of ice, and ice is heavy, and weight up high makes a boat unstable. So the ice had to be chipped off, by hand, by men crawling out onto a slippery surface with an axe while holding on with the other hand. They did this several times. It is not dramatic work. It is closer to clearing a path in the snow, except that the path is moving. Later in the voyage the drinking water turned brackish, which made thirst a real nuisance in the final days. These are the sort of things that actually define such a journey, not moments of crisis, but a long sequence of small practical annoyances, each one dealt with, in turn, by tired people. Wet reindeer hair from the sleeping bags got into everything, including the food. The sail needed constant attention. The pump kept clogging and had to be cleared. And every few hours somebody had to crawl out from under the canvas, take the tiller from a man who had been holding it for 4 hours, and settle down to hold it for 4 hours himself. On the 14th day, Worsley worked out a position which, if he was right, put them close to South Georgia. The next day there were signs, seaweed in the water, and then cormorants, which are birds that do not travel far from land. On the 16th day, in the early afternoon, the cloud lifted a little and one of the men saw the black cliffs of the island ahead. They had crossed 800 nautical miles of open ocean and arrived within sight of a target about 100 miles long, having seen the sun 4 times. It is one of the finest pieces of small boat navigation on record, and Worsley himself was fairly matter-of-fact about it afterwards, in the way that professionals often are about the thing they are best at. They could not land at once, the wind was wrong and the coast was rocky. They waited a day offshore, and then came into a bay on the south side, and put the boat on a beach, and stood on ground that did not move. They had been in that boat for 17 days. There was still a distance to go, because the whaling stations were on the other side of the island and the boat was in no state to sail round. So Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean walked over the interior, which had never been crossed, using a carpenter's adze as an ice axe and screws from the boat set into their boot soles for grip. They took about 36 hours and arrived at the station at Stromness looking, by every account, extremely strange. The other 3 were picked up by boat from the far side within days. Then came the part that took longest, getting back to Elephant Island. Shackleton tried 4 times. Sea ice turned him back again and again over the following months, and it was not until the 30th of August, in a small steam tug lent by the Chilean government and captained by Luis Pardo, that he finally reached the beach and took off all 22 men. Not one of them had been lost. The James Caird herself survived too. She is kept indoors, in England, at a school in Kent, and you can go and look at her. So we will leave the boat pulled up on a stony beach on the far side of the world, with her sail down and her ballast still aboard, and 6 men lying beside her not moving very much at all. The hard part is done. The sea outside the bay is still running the way it always runs, east, around and around the bottom of the world, and it will go on doing that tonight, whether or not anybody is out there watching it. Sleep well. Sleepy history, true stories, told slowly.